purpose of these future drought fund bills appears to be relatively straightforward: to establish a future drought fund that will support drought resilience measures into the future. It talks of an investment of $3.6 billion that will return a dividend of $100 million a year from July 2020, next year. And with that dividend to be spent on drought resilience measures as the minister sees fit, so long as it is consistent with the drought resilient funding plan. Colleagues, while I support the intent of the bill, I feel the bill was rushed out to meet the Drought Summit timeline. I feel it's loosely drafted and does not represent good governance. And in its current form, I'm unable to support the bill. So consequently, I will be moving amendments to the bill in the consideration in detail stage. And I will cover the operations of the fund to make it more transparent, that the minister becomes accountable to the parliament for spending, and that we see good governance designed into the development of the plan, and that proper process is followed in the expenditure of the dividends. And the amendments I propose pick up the concerns raised by the Scrutiny of Bills Committee, by the Senate Committee inquiry into the bill, and the proposed improvements by the National Farmers Federation as part of this inquiry. No small group of people to support me in my amendments. So let me talk about the process of accountability. As it currently stands, the bill lacks accountability to the parliament. It gives all the power to the minister, and there are no checks and balances. It basically says to the minister, trust me. The minister has the power to spend $100 million a year on loosely defined drought resilience objectives, as long as this spend is consistent with the drought resilience funding plan. And the only check on this consistency is by the government's Regional Investment Corporation. Now, the government's Regional Investment Corporation is a bank. And the drought resilience funding plan guiding this investment will be developed by the government's department, and it currently only involves a 20-day consultation period with the community. $100 million a year, a complex plan, and all we get is bankers to oversee it. The drought resilience funding plan will be reviewed every 4 years, but there's no mechanism in the review to check its effectiveness. In fact, there's no mechanism anywhere to account for effectiveness and delivery. The drought resilience funding plan is to be a legislative instrument, but it's not disallowable. So Parliament is not able to disagree with the minister. The Parliament will have no opportunity to hold the minister to account for the content of the plan. So the only role for this Parliament will be, after passing this bill, the only chance the Parliament will have to review the effectiveness of the fund would be a review after 10 years of operation, but even then, the bill is drafted, the report is not required to be tabled in the Parliament or published. So after 10 years of operation, it can be reviewed, but the review won't be published. It doesn't have to be published. And I would say tonight that all Australians should be concerned by the lack of transparency and accountability of $100 million a year. I'm concerned. And it's not just me that's concerned, but clearly it's pretty important that I am, given that this is my background and my interest. But in developing today, in preparing for tonight's debate, we connected with that wonderful group called the National Farmers Federation, not exactly a radical socialised or a group supporting government expenditure. And in their input into the Senate committee inquiry, the NFF raised concerns about the funding plan and expenditure, and they wanted to be incorporated the views of drought and related issue experts, so not just bankers. Let's have someone involved who actually gets rural and regional Australia. And as a member for Farage has said, let's have someone who actually understands agriculture. So the NFF recommend the bill be amended to establish a future drought Fund Consultative Committee. And at the very least, let's get some professional agricultural rural knowledge and skill into the process. I agree, and I will be proposing this committee be established as part of the process. But I'd also like just to briefly talk about some of the recommendations in the Standing Committee on the Scrutiny of Bills. Now, what a wonderful thing this is, the Standing Committee on the Scrutiny of Bills. So they talk about broad discretionary powers, and they basically say the expenditure should be subject to at least some level of parliamentary scrutiny. At least some level. I agree. And in this regard, the committee is concerned that the bill contains no guidance on its face as to the terms or conditions that would be attached to financial assistance grants. So that's pretty interesting, and I would say, well, what's the role for Parliament here? And I will be moving some amendments along those lines. The bill also talks about the merit review and notes that neither the bill nor the explanatory memorandum sets out any particular processes, for example, an application process to be followed by people seeking to obtain a grant or enter into an arrangement. So we've got no idea about what the merits are of the people who get the grant and of the minister who spends $100 million, other than a plan that's been approved by a banking organisation. So there's no link in there at all to how agricultural outcomes or drought resilience will be achieved. So the committee's consistent view is that significant matters relating to a legislative scheme, such as how grants and agreements under the relevant scheme are to be administered, should be included in the primary legislation, or at least in legislative instruments subject to parliamentary disallowment and sunsetting, and unless a sound justification for non-disallowable delegated legislation is provided. And that certainly has not been provided in this legislation. The committee requests that the minister give more detailed advice as to why it is considered necessary and appropriate to permit the agricultural minister to delegate his powers to any official of a Commonwealth entity. I agree. There's more in that report, but I just won't spend all my time talking about it. Well worth a read. Because what I'd actually like to talk about is the issues that we have, and I have to say it's not just me that thinks there's problems here, that there's a large body of people who thinks that we could do better and we should do better. So I will be proposing amendments to the bill, that we look at a review mechanism, that we look at checks and balances in expenditure, that we look at the Productivity Commission to become involved to address the effectiveness of it. The review will occur, ideally, before the plan is reviewed every 4 years, so that review can then be considered as part of the renewal. And I will also ask in my amendments that the Productivity Commission be asked to review the effectiveness of the fund, having regard to clearly economic outcomes, but also social and environment outcomes. Because all of us know that drought affects the economy, it affects the environment and it affects the communities. So we've got to look at how this money is actually used across those three areas. And colleagues, I'd briefly like to talk about the amendments, but I'd also like to talk about a missed opportunity in this legislation. And this is the bit I think that not only the poor governance aspect of it, but what a golden opportunity for rural and regional Australia. $100 million a year. The idea of a plan, if we can get a consultative committee in place, what a difference this money could make to our communities. And if it's only spent on a pipe, what a lost opportunity that would be. If it's only spent on infrastructure and we don't pay attention to the impacts on the environment or the community, what a lost opportunity it would be. So I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity in leadership in rural and regional Australia, the opportunity to work with real people in real places, exactly like the member for Farrer is talking about in her speech, and the opportunity that this money gives us not only to work with resilience and build people's resilience physically, emotionally and also environmentally, but actually position ourselves for future droughts that come by working with local government, by working with community groups to say what's going to happen, how do we actually work together to plan for the future. So let me just talk a little bit about planning. so much money. It could make such a difference if we plan around integration of government policy. And so one of the failings I saw in this bill is that we don't actually talk about how it fits in with other government policy. And just the one I know so much about is our policy on rural and regional Australia. I've been part of the committee looking at the future of regional development and decentralisation. Now, surely a policy that's looking at drought has got to look at regional development and decentralisation. And one of the recommendations in that particular report is we come up with what we call regional plans. And a regional plan is getting everybody together in the community, and we look at Commonwealth, state and local government funding. We look at what we've got and we see where there's duplication and how we can use more of it. So imagine if we develop these regional plans and then together we're able to link to some of this drought resilience money and say, here's how this money can be value added to a whole. What a difference that would make. But it requires government to work together across portfolios. And I really encourage the Minister to give some consideration to how we can value add to this money and get much better bang for our buck through looking at a strategic approach to doing really significant planning, not just planning for the 100 million, but planning for regional Australia and our long-term prosperity. So not only do we have a problem then with missed opportunity around regional planning, but I also want to talk a little bit about what I want to see is in my own electorate of Albury-Wodonga. As the member for Farrer has just said, it's in the Murray-Darling Basin, and we've got this drought at the moment, and we've also got a problem with the Murray-Darling Basin plan. And the huge opportunity to use funding like this to actually bring communities together across difference. And so the opportunity to actually work with the communities of the Murray-Darling Basin. And I just have to take issue with the member for Farrer. While she's a member for the New South Wales side of the river, I just want to say it's a valley, and the valley knows no political boundaries. So we've actually got to work together across the New South Wales Victorian boundary, but also across the political boundaries that we have. So that means working across both sides of parliament. And that's why I think this bill is so important, that we actually think about how that money is going to be spent to give us the greatest bang for our buck. So I'm just going to bring my comments to a close, and I want to talk a little bit about my decision-making framework in speaking tonight. This is a really important piece of legislation. This has the potential to be absolutely fundamental to the future of our rural and regional communities and help our farming communities in particular manage drought. But there are so many problems at the moment. There are problems with grants, there are problems with review. I've mentioned them. So when I was thinking tonight about my approach to how I was voting, is this legislation right in its concepts? I think it is. I think $100 million and a good way of working will make a really big difference. Could this legislation be good for Indi? Absolutely. And good for Australia? Absolutely. The third thing in my decision-making framework is this legislation exhibiting good governance. I don't think so. Consequently, I'll be making some amendments. Are there any unintended consequences attached to this bill? And yes, I think there are. The stakeholders, and I've just quoted the NFF themselves thinks there's problems, Landcare thinks we could do it better, and I'm sure if we opened up wider there would be many really good stakeholders who could value add and tell us about the unintended consequences. And an unregulated grants program will always cause us problems. But in my closing comments, I really would like to acknowledge the departmental staff and the advisors here. You've been an absolute delight to work with, and I look forward to working with you on the amendments and hopefully making this legislation the best legislation it can be so that I can support it and have the benefits come to my community and to Australia, just as we hope will happen.